Ryan Mercer's voice cut across the range like a whip crack. Someone tell me why there's a girl with a museum piece trying to check in for a precision evaluation. He didn't lower his voice. He didn't intend to. The laughter that followed was immediate, comfortable, the kind that comes from men who've never once considered they might be wrong. Olivia Carter heard every word. She didn't turn around. She just kept walking. That old rifle case hanging from her hand, like she'd carried it 10,000 miles and intended to carry it 10,000 more. If you've ever watched someone get dismissed before they even had a chance to speak, you already know what happened next. Subscribe to our channel, drop your city in the comments, so I can see how far this story travels and stay until the very end. Because what Olivia did next shook every person on that range to their foundation. The Arizona desert doesn't forgive weakness. That's not a metaphor. It's a physical fact that every shooter standing at the Ridgecrest Precision Evaluation Facility understood in their bones before they ever pulled a trigger. The heat comes up off the ground in visible waves, bending light, warping distance, turning a clean 200-yard shot into something that requires a mind capable of calculating what the air itself is doing. Misjudge the shimmer and your round drifts. Misjudge the crosswind and you've wasted a shot that looked perfect in your head. The range does not care how many trophies you've won. It does not care what your commanding officer said about you at the last briefing. It cares only about what you can actually do when everything is working against you. That quarterly evaluation was supposed to be routine. Competitive, yes. High stakes, absolutely. Careers had been shaped by performance at Ridgecrest, recommendations written, and promotions accelerated based on what a shooter did across those 10 steel targets. But routine in the sense that everyone already knew more or less how the rankings were going to fall. Staff Sergeant Ryan Mercer was sitting at the top of the informal predictions board before the day even started. He'd finished first 2 quarters running. He had a sponsor deal quietly in the works with a tactical optics manufacturer. He carried himself the way men do when they've been told they're exceptional for long enough that they've stopped questioning it. There were 16 competitors registered for this cycle. 12 of them had histories that read like highlights reels. Long-range records, combat, deployment, citations, specialized training credentials that took years to accumulate. The other 4 were either newer talent being evaluated for potential or transfers from other facilities looking to establish their standing at Ridgecrest. And then there was Olivia Carter. She arrived without announcement. No vehicle escort, no aide carrying her equipment, no cluster of colleagues around her the way the more socially embedded competitors tended to travel. She came through the main gate at the facility with a standard check-in form, a quietly worn rifle case that had clearly seen decades of use and nothing else. The facility administrator who processed her paperwork later said he almost asked her if she was looking for the administrative building instead of the range. He caught himself, but only barely. She was small. That was the first thing people noticed, and they noticed it the way people notice something they instantly decide is relevant information. 5'4", maybe 5'5", with the kind of stillness about her that could be read as either calm or timidity, depending on what you were already looking for. Her uniform was regulation but not flashy. No personalized patches beyond what was required. No tactical accessories dangling off her kit that weren't strictly functional. She wore her hair up, her expression neutral, and she moved through the facility's staging area like a woman who had somewhere specific to be and wasn't interested in anything that wasn't that destination. Ryan Mercer was the first one to say something out loud, but he wasn't the first one to think it. He had an audience of 3, Corporal Dennis Hatch Specialist Aaron Webb, and a long-range shooter from a Nevada facility named Mike Carraway, who'd driven 6 hours for this evaluation. Mercer made his comment about the museum piece and the girl, and the laughter was the kind that bonds men quickly. The shared understanding that they were all seeing the same thing and all agreeing on what it meant. Olivia did not acknowledge it. She walked to her assigned staging position, set down her rifle case, and began her preparation routine with the focused efficiency of someone who had run the same pre-evaluation checklist so many times that her hands knew the sequence before her mind finished the thought. From the observation tower, Major Ethan Brooks watched her arrive. Brooks was not participating in the evaluation. His role was oversight, documentation, scoring, verification, and the kind of broad picture assessment that command used to identify not just high performers, but the nature of their performance. He'd been doing this for 4 years at Ridgecrest. He'd seen arrogance win and humility lose, and vice versa, and he'd learned to distrust his initial impressions of shooters because the range had taught him repeatedly that the ones who looked the part were not always the ones who played it best. He noticed Olivia because of the rifle case initially. That old, worn case was incongruous in a way that tickled something in the back of his mind. Then he noticed the way she moved through the staging area, and that tickle became something more insistent. Most competitors, especially in the pre-evaluation window, were social. They talked, they compared gear. They staked out psychological territory with each other through the quiet competition of casual conversation. How many people asked you how your prep went? Whether anyone noted your equipment with the particular look that meant impressed. Olivia was doing none of that. She was sitting at her position doing something Brooks needed his field glasses to identify clearly. She was writing in a notebook, not reviewing notes, not checking a pre-written reference card. Writing, actively, carefully, her pen moving in small, deliberate strokes, while her eyes moved from the page to the range environment and back again. Brooks lowered his field glasses and wrote a single note of his own. He underlined it twice. On the range floor, Ryan Mercer drifted past Olivia's position during what was technically a final equipment check window, but was practically a social hour for the top competitors. He looked at her setup with the elaborate casualness of a man who wanted to be seen not caring and couldn't quite pull it off. That scope, he said not to her specifically, just into the general air near where she was sitting, is that a factory-mounted optic? Olivia looked up from her notebook. Her expression was calm in a way that took Mercer slightly off guard because he'd expected either hostility or uncertainty and got neither. "Yes," she said. Mercer made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "This isn't a club shoot, Staff Sergeant. These targets don't move close." "I know," Olivia said. "Your dope card looks short," he said, glancing at her notebook with the studied disinterest of someone actually very interested. "It's not a dope card," she said. He waited, expecting more. She went back to writing. He stood there for 2 seconds longer than was comfortable, then moved on. Behind him, Dennis Hatch grinned. Mercer didn't look back at him. "She won't make it past target 4, Hatch said quietly, falling into step beside Mercer as they moved toward their own positions. "She won't make it past target 3, Mercer said. "Desert's doing full thermal distortion today. You have to feel it, and that kind of feel takes years to develop." "Does she have years?" Mercer glanced back once briefly. Olivia wasn't watching him. She was watching the wind indicators at the far end of the range, and she was still writing. "Not the right kind," he said. The evaluation began at 0900 hours. The range officer, Chief Warrant Officer Dale Simmons, had been running these evaluations for 11 years and had long since stopped caring about interpersonal drama among the competitors. What he cared about was accuracy and time. He gave the standard briefing with the efficiency of a man who had given it 400 times, covered the scoring parameters. 10 targets, full engagement required. Time and accuracy both factored into final ranking, and then stepped back to let the clock become the only authority that mattered. The format was sequential but not simultaneous. Competitors rotated through engagement positions in assigned pairs with overlapping windows that kept the pace moving without creating direct interference. Scores were logged in real time to a digital board visible, both on the range floor and in the observation tower. Every hit registered, every miss registered. Timestamps were automatic. Ryan Mercer drew the first engagement window. He settled into position with the practiced economy of someone who had done this enough times that the physical mechanics were below conscious thought. He worked through the first 3 targets with clean efficiency, hit, 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 and the cluster of observers near the tower murmured approval. His time splits were tight. His adjustments between targets were minimal because he'd pre-calculated most of them. This was what elite looked like, and everyone watching understood it. Then the 4th target gave him trouble. It wasn't his fault, technically. The wind shifted a crosswind component that the range's own instrumentation logged as a 7-degree deviation in a 3-second window. Mercer read it late, adjusted slightly under, and his round hit the steel frame rather than the kill zone center. A hit still but degraded. He absorbed it with a slight tightening around his eyes, reset, and continued. But the smoothness was fractured now, just slightly like a hairline crack in otherwise perfect glass. He finished all 10 targets. His time was 21 minutes, 14 seconds. The scoreboard reflected a strong performance good enough for first place in the early rotation by a margin that should have been comfortable. He stood and rolled his shoulders and accepted the quiet acknowledgement from Hatch and Webb with the ease of someone who expected nothing less. Olivia's window opened fourth in the rotation. The three competitors between Mercer and Olivia each produced solid results. No one broke Mercer's time. No one matched his accuracy on the early targets. By the time Olivia approached her first engagement position, the informal consensus on the floor was already calcifying. Mercer had the evaluation. The real interest was who came second. Olivia set up with the same economy she'd shown in staging. No theatrics, no visible adjustment ritual that might signal nerves or over-preparation. She opened her notebook, set it where she could access it without moving from her position, and went still. The range officer called her window open. She didn't shoot. 5 seconds passed. 15. Someone behind the observation rope said quietly, "Is she having a problem?" Chief Warrant Officer Simmons watched his clock. He had a standard protocol for competitors who didn't engage within the first minute: a check-in, then a warning, then a formal pause to assess equipment issues. He'd reach for his radio twice in those first 45 seconds before something made him wait. Olivia was looking at the first target, then she was looking at the wind indicators. Then she was writing something in her notebook. Her hands were completely steady. "She's observing," Brooks said from the tower quietly enough that only the facility analyst beside him could hear it. "Before she shoots," the analyst said. "Before she shoots," Brooks confirmed, and there was something in his voice that the analyst couldn't quite categorize. Not discomfort exactly, something more like the beginning of recalibration. At 30 seconds, Olivia raised her rifle. At 41 seconds, she fired. The steel at target 1 rang out across the range, a clean center zone impact that the acoustic sensors logged as a scoring hit before the sound had fully dissipated. The tone it made was different from the frame strike Mercer had registered on target 4. Rimless, full contact, dead center. No one said anything. Olivia wrote a brief note. Then she moved to the second position. Ryan Mercer heard the first shot from where he was standing near the equipment racks. He'd been explaining to Mike Carraway why his target 4 adjustment had been within acceptable parameters given the wind shift. He stopped explaining when he heard the hit. Something about the sound of it, not just the acoustic confirmation, but the rhythm of what came before it, the significant pause that shouldn't have produced a result that clean made him turn toward the range floor. He watched Olivia move to position 2. She settled. She paused. Not as long this time. She was referencing whatever she'd written in the notebook, spending 12 seconds before she fired. Hit, center. The sensors confirmed it immediately. "What is she doing with that notebook?" Carraway said. Mercer didn't answer because he didn't have an answer that would maintain the casualness he was trying to project, and he knew it. Target 3. Same rhythm. Observe note, brief confirmation, pause fire. Hit. Target 4, the position where the wind shift had caught Mercer. Olivia paused longer. She wrote more. She spent 23 seconds before she pulled the trigger. Hit. Center zone. The sensors logged it as the cleanest impact on that specific target anyone had produced in 4 evaluation cycles. Dennis Hatch, who had been standing near the range floor observation rope with Aaron Webb, said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "She wrote something down before she shot that one." "I see it," Webb said. "That's not a dope card," Hatch said, using Mercer's words from earlier, but with a different tone, now uncertain rather than dismissive. "What is she writing?" On the floor, Olivia was already moving to position 5. She hadn't looked at the scoreboard. She hadn't looked at the other competitors. She moved with the focused linearity of someone whose attention was entirely allocated and had no surplus to spend on anything outside the task. Target 5 was at an extreme distance, far enough that heat distortion was a significant factor at that time of day. 3 of the competitors who'd shot before her had taken multiple attempts on target 5, using their allowed re-engagements to chase a result the distortion kept stealing from them. Their times on that target were the worst splits in the evaluation so far. Olivia paused at position 5 for 31 seconds. She wrote in the notebook. She paused 4 more seconds. She fired. Hit. The sensors logged it as a center zone impact. The murmur that ran through the observation area was different from anything that had come before it. This wasn't the polite acknowledgement of solid performance. This was the sound of people who had decided what they were watching and were now being told quietly but firmly that they had been wrong. Brooks had come down from the observation tower and was standing at the range floor perimeter, which he almost never did during active evaluation windows. The facility analyst had tried to ask him something twice and given up. Brooks was watching Olivia move to position 6, and he was thinking about something that he couldn't quite articulate yet, but that was pressing against the inside of his mind with increasing urgency. She was not reacting to the range. Every other shooter out there was reactive. They engaged the environment as it presented itself to them, adjusted after the fact, corrected errors, chased the conditions. Good shooters did this faster and more accurately than poor ones, but the fundamental relationship was the same. The environment acted and the shooter responded. Olivia was doing something different. She was writing down what the environment was going to do before it did it. That's what the notebook was, not past data predictions. She was reading the heat patterns, the wind behavior, the light angle, and its effect on the target's surface, and she was calculating forward. By the time she fired, she wasn't reacting to current conditions. She was shooting into where the conditions were going to be when her round arrived. Brooks had read about this approach. He'd heard it discussed in advanced marksmanship theory circles and academic papers that most field shooters never encountered. He had never in 11 years of range oversight seen it executed in real time under evaluation conditions by a shooter who made it look like routine maintenance. He pulled out his radio and called the documentation officer. "Pull Carter's full service record," he said. "Everything in the file, send it to my tablet." The documentation officer paused. "Sir, we have an active evaluation window." "I'm aware," Brooks said. "Pull the file." Target 6 fell to her. Target 7 fell to her. Target 8, which had a partial concealment element that cost even Mercer a hesitation on his run, fell to her with the same unbroken rhythm that had characterized every engagement before it. Mercer was standing at the range floor perimeter now. He'd stopped pretending he wasn't watching. Around him, the casual cluster of competitors and observers had evolved into something more focused, more silent, the kind of silence that falls when people collectively realize they are watching something that doesn't fit the category they'd assigned it to. At target 9, Olivia paused longer than she had at any previous position. 44 seconds, long enough that Simmons almost called in for a check, long enough that the silence on the floor became its own kind of pressure. She wrote 3 separate notations in the notebook. She adjusted her position by a fraction that was invisible from the observation distance, but that Brooks, watching through his field glasses, could see was deliberate, a fine physical correction that translated to a significant change in projected trajectory at the target distance. She fired, hit, center zone, the cleanest impact on target 9 that Ridgecrest had recorded in 2 evaluation cycles. Ryan Mercer exhaled slowly. He realized he'd been holding his breath. He looked at Hatch beside him and found Hatch looking back at him with an expression that matched exactly what he was feeling, which was the specific discomfort of having said something definitive and loudly and in public that the facts were now methodically disassembling. "She's going to finish," Hatch said. "Yeah," Mercer said. He didn't add anything else because there wasn't anything to add. Target 10 waited. In the evaluation structure, target 10 wasn't just the last target. It was positioned specifically to be the hardest. The distance, the angle, and in the late morning heat, the distortion factor, combining into a shot that tested every element of a shooter's capability simultaneously. Mercer's time split on target 10 in his last evaluation cycle had been his longest by a significant margin. The target had a history of humbling people who'd performed well on the first 9. Olivia approached position 10 with the same unhurried linearity she'd shown at every other position. She set her notebook where she could see it. She studied the target. She studied the wind indicators. She looked at something in the middle distance that no one else seemed to be looking at, the way the heat shimmer was moving the specific oscillation pattern of the distortion field between her and the target. She wrote more than she'd written at any single position. A full notation, methodical, every line placed with care. Then she was still. The range was completely quiet. Even the ambient facility sounds equipment, distant vehicles, the low mechanical hum of the scoring system seemed to recede. Brooks had stopped breathing. Simmons had his clock running but wasn't looking at it. Mercer stood with his arms at his sides like someone who'd forgotten what to do with them. Olivia raised her rifle, one breath visible in the slight rise and fall of her shoulders. Complete stillness. She fired. The acoustic sensors registered the impact in the same fraction of a second that the human observers heard the steel ring out, In the tone of it, full, clean, unambiguous, center zone contact cut across the range like a declaration. The digital scoreboard updated. Time elapsed 17 minutes 42 seconds. All 10 targets confirmed hits. For a long moment, the number simply sat there in the silence, while every person on the range did the same calculations simultaneously. Previous range record, 19 minutes 8 seconds. Set 3 years ago by a competitor who'd been written up in a tactical shooting publication as one of the most naturally gifted precision shooters the facility had evaluated in a decade. 1742 was not close to that record. It did not edge it or trim it or nudge it. It destroyed it by a margin that wasn't supposed to be possible under current-day conditions on that specific course configuration. Then someone in the observation area started to speak and couldn't find the words, and that half sound, that open mouth producing no output, somehow broke the silence in a way that released everything else. People began talking, several at once. Disbelief layered over disbelief. Simmons confirmed the score verbally over the range communication system with the tone of a man who was still running the math in his head. The digital board showed the new record flag automatically, the software having been programmed to recognize new records without human input, and that automated acknowledgement somehow made it more real than any verbal confirmation could have. Olivia closed her notebook. She didn't look at the scoreboard. She didn't look at the cluster of observers. She checked her weapon with the same methodical efficiency she'd brought to every other step of her process, cleared it, and began the procedure of securing her equipment. Brooks was watching her face from 15 yards away. No smile, no exhale of relief, no visible satisfaction at what she'd just done. The absence of reaction was not suppression. She wasn't holding something back. The calm was genuine. The completion of 10 targets in a record time was to all visible evidence within the range of what Olivia Carter considered a normal day's work. That calmness reached Brooks in a way that the score itself hadn't quite managed. The score was extraordinary. The calmness was something else. It was the suggestion that the score wasn't the ceiling, that what they'd just seen might not even be the best she could do, that she had walked onto this range, done what she came to do, and found the experience unremarkable. He pulled out his tablet. The service record he'd requested had come through. He opened it, expecting depth, the kind of extensive file that preceded a performance like this, the training records and citations, an accumulated history of someone who'd reached this level. The file was thin, startlingly, almost inexplicably thin. 7 pages. Assignments, log transfers, recorded evaluation scores from 3 previous facilities, all showing strong but unremarkable numbers. Nothing that would flag a shooter for special attention. No citations for exceptional marksmanship. No notes from commanding officers describing standout capability. A record that read on its own without the context of what he just watched would not have made anyone look twice. Brooks stared at the file for a long moment. Then he looked up at Olivia, who was zipping her rifle case with the same quiet economy she'd had when she arrived, and he thought about what it meant for a shooter of this caliber to have a file this empty. You didn't accidentally understate a record like that. You didn't forget to log a record like that. You chose not to, or someone chose for you. Either way, the gap between what was in that file and what had just happened on this range was not an administrative oversight. It was a story. And Brooks, standing there with an empty tablet, file in one hand, and a scoreboard showing an impossible record in the other, was beginning to understand that he was only at the very beginning of it. Ryan Mercer walked toward Olivia, not with the casual drift of earlier. This was a direct approach, purposeful. The walk of a man who has decided to do something before he can think himself out of it. He stopped 2 yards from her and waited until she looked up. When she did, he said, "How?" Olivia regarded him for a moment. "How what?" "The notebook," he said. "What were you writing?" "Predictions," she said. He waited for more. She offered the same stillness she'd given him the first time he'd approached her. "Predictions of what?" he finally asked. "Where the round needs to go," she said, "given where the conditions are going to be when it gets there. Not where they are when you pull the trigger. Where they're going to be." Mercer processed this. "You're calculating forward." "Yes." "In real time." "Yes." He looked at the notebook, and her hand closed now. Unremarkable, the kind of composition notebook you could buy at any general store. "How long have you been doing that?" Olivia considered the question with more thought than it seemed to require. "Long enough," she said, "that I don't know what it looks like to anyone who hasn't." Mercer stood with that for a moment. Then he looked at the scoreboard one more time, 1742, still glowing in the afternoon light, and back at Olivia. Your record is going to stand for a long time, he said. Records don't matter, Olivia said. She picked up her rifle case. The understanding behind them does. She walked past him toward the facility exit, and Mercer turned and watched her go, and around him the range was still buzzing with the particular energy of people trying to categorize something that didn't fit any category they'd brought with them. In the observation tower, Brooks had one question written on his notepad below the file discrepancy he'd flagged in the double underlined observation from the morning. The question was, who trained her? He circled it 3 times, then he started making calls. Brooks made 4 calls in the first 20 minutes after Olivia left the range floor, and none of them gave him what he was looking for. The first call went to the records division at the training command that had processed Olivia's most recent transfer. The clerk on the other end was polite, thorough, and completely unhelpful. The file she had access to matched what Brooks had already pulled on his tablet. 7 pages, nothing. Flagged, nothing remarkable. She confirmed the transfer dates, the facility assignments, the evaluation scores that sat in the solid but unremarkable middle tier of what a career shooter accumulated over time. When Brooks asked if there were supplemental records, attachments, anything cross-referenced under a secondary identifier, the clerk went quiet for a moment and then said carefully that what she had was what she had. The second call went to the commanding officer at Olivia's previous facility, a lieutenant colonel named Gaines, who picked up on the third ring and immediately said, I figured someone would call about Carter. That sentence alone told Brooks more than the entire 7-page file. Tell me what you know, Brooks said. Gaines was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone thinking about how to answer. The quiet of someone thinking about how much to answer. She performed well here, he said finally, within the parameters we evaluated her on. That's not what I asked. Another pause. I'm aware. She just broke your facility's record by over 90 seconds, Brooks said. Every target, all 10, under full thermal distortion and shifting crosswind, with factory-mounted optics and a rifle case that looks like it predates digital scoring systems. I know, Gaines said. You know. I know what she's capable of, Major. I've known for a while. Brooks pressed the tablet against his leg to keep from snapping it. Then why is her file 7 pages? The silence on the other end lasted long enough that Brooks thought the call had dropped. Then Gaines said quietly and with a weight that didn't fit a routine administrative question, because that's how she wanted it. The third and fourth calls confirmed nothing new. By the time Brooks gave up on the phone approach and walked back to the facility's main briefing room, he had a new record on his scoreboard and an empty file on his tablet, a quote from a lieutenant colonel who clearly knew things he wasn't ready to say, and approximately 45 minutes before the afternoon debrief brought all 16 competitors into the same room. He sat down, opened a fresh page in his notepad, and wrote Olivia Carter's name at the top. Then he underlined it, and below the line he wrote one word, why. Not why had she broken the record. That answer was in the notebook she carried and the mind that filled it. The why that mattered was different. Why was someone capable of that level of performance sitting in a 7-page file that wouldn't earn a second glance from anyone in command? Why had Gaines, who clearly understood what he had not said, so in writing anywhere that Brooks could find? And why had Olivia walked into this evaluation without a single person in the room knowing who she was? Those 3 questions were the same question, wearing different clothes. Brooks was certain of that. He just didn't have the clothes off yet. Ryan Mercer came through the briefing room door at 14:43, 7 minutes before the scheduled debrief, which was the earliest Brooks had ever seen him arrive for anything. He was alone, which was also unusual. Mercer generally moved with the comfortable gravity of someone who accumulated company without trying. He sat down 2 seats from Brooks, which was unusual enough that Brooks looked up. Sir, Mercer said. Mercer. Mercer was quiet for a moment in a way that was clearly the wind-up for something. Brooks waited it out. Her file, Mercer said. You pulled it. Brooks kept his expression neutral. What makes you think that? Because I saw your face after she left the range, and you had your tablet in your hand. Mercer leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table. It's thin, isn't it? It wasn't a question. Brooks looked at him. What do you know about Carter? Less than I should, Mercer said. And the honesty in that was so uncharacteristic of the man Brooks had spent the morning watching that it functioned as its own kind of data point. I asked around after the evaluation. Nobody here knows her. Nobody from her listed previous facilities is in the current rotation. I've been in this community for 9 years, sir. 9 years. You get to know names at this level. You get to know reputations. And her name doesn't exist, Mercer said. Not in the way names at this level exist. She's not a rumor. She's not a whisper. She's not someone people talk about in the way they'd talk about someone who shoots like that. She's nothing. Until today, she was nothing, and I don't understand how that's possible. Brooks said nothing for a moment. Then, you mocked her equipment this morning. Mercer didn't flinch. Yes, sir, I did. He said it without the hedging or qualification Brooks might have expected. I was wrong. I don't say that easily, and I'm not saying it to score points. I'm saying it because I need you to understand that I take what I saw seriously. Whatever is in that file or not in that file, she earned something today that I cannot explain with the information I have. The other competitors began filtering in before Brooks could respond to that, and the room shifted from a quiet exchange into the organized chaos of 16 people finding seats, checking phones, exchanging low comments about the day's results. The scoreboard at the front of the room displayed the day's full rankings with Olivia's 1742 at the top in a way that every person who came through the door looked at immediately and then looked away from slightly too quickly. Like touching something hot, Olivia came in near the end of the arrival window. She sat near the back on the right side and opened her notebook. Not the evaluation notebook, a different one, newer, its cover still stiff. She wrote something in it before the debrief even started. Brooks watched Dennis Hatch watch her sit down. Hatch said something low to Aaron Webb beside him. Webb looked at his phone instead of responding, which was its own kind of response. Brooks stood, and the room came to order with the practiced efficiency of a military gathering. He ran the debrief the way he always did, results by position, split times accuracy breakdowns, environmental factors logged during the evaluation window. He read Mercer's performance with the measured language of official documentation, strong execution, minor deviation on target 4 consistent with the logged wind event, overall performance, placing him second in the quarterly ranking. Mercer nodded once, the tight nod of someone who has already processed the result and made his peace with it. When Brooks reached Quarterstaff, Sergeant Olivia, the room temperature changed in the way rooms do when something everyone is thinking about becomes the thing being said out loud. 10 targets completed, Brooks said. All hits, all within the scoring center zone. Time of completion, 17 minutes 42 seconds. He paused exactly long enough for the number to land. New Ridgecrest facility record. He didn't editorialize. He didn't add emphasis. The facts were sufficient. The silence that followed lasted about 4 seconds. Then Mike Caraway from the Nevada facility said, "By how much previous record was 1908? Brooks said, "Margin of 86 seconds. Someone in the back made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Hatch was looking at the scoreboard. Webb had put his phone down. Mercer was looking at his hands. Olivia was writing in her notebook. After the formal rankings, Brooks opened the floor for questions in the standard debrief format. 3 came in quick succession about environmental factors, the crosswind event, the heat distortion on targets 4 and 9, the scoring software's accuracy on center zone hits at extreme distance. Brooks answered them all in sequence. Then Caraway, who apparently had decided he was going to be the one to say the thing, put his hand up and said, "Can Staff Sergeant Carter speak to her methodology?" Every head in the room turned toward the back. Olivia looked up from her notebook. Her expression was the same settled calm it had been all day, unmoved by the attention, untroubled by the question. She looked at Caraway for a moment, then at Brooks, who gave her the slight nod that meant the floor was hers, if she wanted it. She set her pen down. "What do you want to know?" she said. "The notebook," Caraway said. "You were writing before every engagement. What was in it?" "Environmental projections," Olivia said. "Wind behavior modeling based on observable indicators. Heat distortion trajectory based on time of day surface temperature and the specific angle of incoming light relative to each target position. Round travel time factored against projected condition changes during flight." A beat of silence. Then Specialist Webb said, "You calculated all of that in real time?" "Yes." "By hand?" "Yes." Webb shook his head slowly, the way you shake your head when mathematics has personally offended you. That takes computational support. That's not something you do with a notebook and a pen during an active evaluation. It is, Olivia said, if you've done it long enough. How long? Caraway said. Olivia picked her pen back up. Long enough, she said, which was the same answer she'd given Mercer on the range floor, and it landed in the room with the same quality of finality that had characterized every other statement she'd made all day. Mercer, who had been quiet through the entire exchange, said, "Where did you learn it?" The room shifted slightly at that. The question was more direct than what Caraway had been asking, less technical and more personal, and the fact that it came from Mercer, who everyone in the room knew had mocked her publicly that morning, gave it an edge that a neutral person asking the same thing wouldn't have produced. Olivia looked at him, not with hostility, not with the satisfaction of someone who has earned the right to a pointed answer. With the same even attention she gave everything. "I developed it," she said. "You developed the methodology," Mercer said. It wasn't quite skeptical. It was the tone of a man trying to hold two pieces of information in his hands that don't quite fit together yet. "Yes." "From what base?" "From what wasn't working," she said. "Standard doping methods are reactive. You're always catching up to conditions that have already changed. I wanted to stop catching up." She paused. "So I built something that didn't require catching up." The room was very quiet. Then Caraway said, "Have you published this? Written it up? Because what you're describing, the computational structure alone." "No," Olivia said. "Why not?" She looked at Caraway with an expression that was the closest thing to an emotion he had seen from her all day. Not warmth exactly, something between patience and a very old tiredness. "Because the point was never the methodology," she said. "The point was the result." Brooks watched Ryan Mercer sit back in his chair and cross his arms, not in the defensive gesture of someone resisting information, but in the posture of someone who has just had their understanding of a situation substantially reorganized and needs a moment. The debrief closed out at 15:30. People filtered toward the exit in the usual clusters, small groups already processing the day's results went into the social mathematics of reputation and standing. Olivia was one of the first to leave with the same unhurried economy that had characterized every transition she'd made since arriving. Brooks waited until the room had cleared to about half its occupant count, then stepped outside and caught up with her in the corridor before she reached the facility exit. "Staff Sergeant Carter," he said. She stopped, turned, waited with the patience of someone who had been expecting this. "Major," she said. "I'd like 5 minutes," Brooks said. "Not official, not logged." She considered this for a moment that felt longer than it was, then nodded. They found a corner of the facility's equipment storage corridor where the foot traffic was zero, and the ambient noise was the low hum of climate control systems, and Brooks pulled out his tablet and turned the screen toward her. The 7-page file, her name at the top, the sparse interior. "This is your record," he said. She looked at it without expression. "I know. It doesn't match what happened on that range today." "No," she said, "it doesn't." "I spoke to Lieutenant Colonel Gaines," Brooks said. "He told me the file looks the way it does because that's how you wanted it." Olivia didn't react to Gaines's name, didn't shift or tighten the way people do when caught off guard. She'd known he might call Gaines. She'd probably mapped the entire sequence of calls he'd make. Brooks was beginning to understand that about her that very little happened in her environment that she hadn't already accounted for. "That's accurate," she said. "Why?" Brooks said, and he heard in his own voice the same genuine bafflement that had driven 4 phone calls in 45 minutes of dead-end investigation. Olivia was quiet for a moment, and in that moment, Brooks had the distinct impression that she was deciding not what to say but how much of it. "Because a visible file creates expectations," she said finally, "and expectations create interference. People perform differently when they think they're performing for someone who already knows what they can do, and they evaluate differently when they already have a number in their head." Brooks processed this. "You wanted to walk in unknown." "I wanted the evaluation to be clean," she said. "No prior data, no reputation creating static in anyone's assessment. Just the performance." "You sandbagged your previous evaluations," Brooks said. The realization hit him as he said it. "I performed within what the evaluations measured," Olivia said carefully. "I didn't perform beyond what the evaluations were designed to capture." "That's the same thing." "It's not," she said. "One is deception, the other is calibration." Brooks stared at her. He had 22 years of range experience and a reputation in command circles for seeing people clearly, and he was standing in a storage corridor, being gently but firmly outmaneuvered in a semantic argument by a woman whose file said she was ordinary. "Why today?" he said. "Why show it today?" For the first time, something shifted in Olivia's expression. Not much. A slight change around the eyes, something that might have been amusement, or might have been something older and more complicated than amusement. "Because today I was asked," she said. "The evaluation asked everyone the same. Not by the evaluation," she said, "by the conditions. The heat today was exactly right. The wind pattern was exactly the configuration I needed. The target spread was the specific one I'd been waiting for. I've been at 3 facilities in 18 months, waiting for a set of conditions that would require every element of the methodology simultaneously." She paused. Today was the day. Brooks looked at her for a long moment. The tablet in his hand felt suddenly inadequate, a 7-page document trying to contain something that clearly required more room than that. "What do you want?" he said. "From today, from this facility, from me." Olivia looked at him steadily. "I want the methodology to be used," she said. "Not by me, by the people who need it. By the shooters who are losing rounds they shouldn't be losing because they're chasing conditions instead of predicting them." She glanced down the corridor toward the range, then back to Brooks. "I've spent 3 years refining this. I know it works. Today confirmed what I already knew, but today isn't the point." She paused. "Getting it into training is the point." Brooks felt something click into place. Not everything, the full picture was still forming, but enough. "You want to teach it," he said. "I already have," she said. He stopped. "What?" "The methodology," Olivia said with the careful precision of someone who has been waiting for exactly this question. "I've already taught it to 17 shooters across 3 facilities over the past 4 years. The core framework adapted for their individual calibration styles." Brooks ran the math on that number. 17 shooters, 3 facilities, 4 years. A methodology for predictive environmental compensation that he'd never seen documented anywhere in the training literature. "Where are these shooters now?" he said. "Competing," she said simply. "At what level?" "Quarterly evaluations. Regional competitions. 2 of them are in current deployment rotations doing work that requires exactly this kind of precision." She looked at him. "They're performing at the top of their respective cohorts. They have been for the past 2 years." Brooks stood very still. He was doing a calculation of his own now, one that had nothing to do with target distances or wind compensation. He was calculating what it meant that a methodology powerful enough to break a range record by 86 seconds had been quietly circulating through 17 carriers across multiple facilities for 4 years and had never surfaced in any documentation he'd seen. Never generated a flag, never produced a report that said, "Something is different about these shooters. Something is better." "Where did it come from?" "No one connected the dots," he said. "No one knew there were dots," Olivia said. "Because your file doesn't mention teaching," she said. "Because I wasn't asked to teach. I taught because it needed to be done, and the people who needed it were in front of me, and I had what they needed." Brooks looked at the tablet again. 7 pages. He thought about what those 7 pages were failing to contain. He thought about 17 shooters performing at the top of their cohorts, unaware that they were connected to each other through the mind of a woman whose official record described nothing remarkable. "You built a program," he said, "unofficially, without authorization, without documentation." "I built a capability," Olivia said. "The program question is yours to answer." A noise from the far end of the corridor, footsteps approaching, then diverting, made them both pause. When the sound faded, Brooks said, "Mercer." "What about him?" Olivia said. "He's the top-ranked shooter at this facility. He has the ear of 3 people in the training command structure. If you want this methodology institutionalized, actually integrated, not just floating in 17 heads, he's a path to that." Olivia looked at Brooks with an expression that suggested she had already considered this and arrived somewhere that took longer to reach than it looked. "Mercer's ego took a significant hit today," she said. "Yes. Men who take hits to their ego do one of 2 things," she said. "They regroup and they grow. Or they find a way to make what hit them wrong." "Which way does Mercer go?" "I don't know yet," she said. "That's why I haven't approached him." Brooks nodded slowly. The intelligence of that calculation, the patience it required, the willingness to wait for data before committing to a direction was entirely consistent with everything he'd watched her do on the range. She didn't rush, she observed. She wrote it down. She fired when she was certain not before. "What do you need from me?" he said. "Access to the training curriculum records," she said, "and 20 minutes with the range scoring data from the past 4 years across the 3 facilities where my students are stationed." Brooks looked at her. "You want to show me the pattern?" "I want to show you what's already there," she said. "You're going to see it anyway. I'm offering to shorten the timeline." He thought about that for a moment. Then he said, "My office, 0800 tomorrow." "I'll be there," Olivia said. She picked up her notebook, the new one from the briefing room, and started toward the facility exit. "Carter," Brooks said. She stopped but didn't turn fully, half turn over her shoulder waiting. "Why come back to evaluation rotation?" he said. "If you've been teaching it, if you've already built this thing, why come back to the range yourself? Why today?" Olivia thought about that, really thought about it the way she thought about everything with time and deliberate attention before the answer came. "Because the people I trained needed to know it was real," she said, "not just in principle, not just in their own results." She paused. "They needed to see it validated under conditions that no one could dispute. They needed a record." The full weight of what she just said landed on Brooks in stages. She hadn't come to Ridgecrest to prove herself. She'd come to prove the methodology to create an undeniable, documented, publicly witnessed proof of concept that her students could point to. She had used her own performance as evidence not of her ability, but of theirs. She walked out. Brooks stood in the corridor with his tablet, his 7-page file, and a question that had started as who trained her and had arrived somewhere else entirely, somewhere that made the original question feel almost beside the point. In the parking area, Ryan Mercer was sitting on the front edge of his vehicle with his arms crossed and the look of a man who had been waiting without being sure what he was waiting for. He saw Olivia come out of the facility exit and made the decision in real time. He pushed off the vehicle and crossed the distance between them before he could talk himself out of it. "Carter," he said. She stopped. The calm again, that settled undefensive stillness that he'd been trying to categorize all day, without success. "The things I said this morning," Mercer said, "on the range, before you shot." "I know," she said. "I'm sorry," he said. Not elaborated, not qualified, not cushioned in context. Just the 2 words delivered like he meant them and understood that they were the only ones that mattered. Olivia looked at him for a moment. "The wind doesn't care about your rank, Mercer," she said. "The target doesn't care about your story." She said it without heat, without the edge it might have carried from someone else's mouth. "Neither of those things are about you specifically. They're just true." "I know that now," he said. "You knew it before," she said. "You just forgot." Mercer didn't have an answer for that because she was right and they both knew it, and there was nothing useful in pretending otherwise. "The methodology," he said. "The notebook. I want to understand it." "I know," she said. "Will you show me?" Olivia looked at him with that expression again, the one that carried more information than her face was explicitly communicating, the look of someone calculating forward. 0900 tomorrow, she said. "Bring a notebook." Not a dope card, a notebook. She walked to her vehicle. Mercer stood and watched her go, and this time when he turned back toward the facility, he didn't have the look of a man who'd been beaten. He had the look of a man who had just been handed a question he actually wanted to spend time answering. Inside the facility, Brooks had called his documentation officer and requested 4 years of scoring data from 3 specific installations. He sat with his notepad, Carter's name at the top, the word "why," underlined below it, and added a new line. He wrote, "She already built it." He circled it once. Then he turned the page and started from the beginning. The 4-year scoring data arrived in Brooks's inbox at 22:14 that night, long after the facility had gone quiet and the day's competitors had dispersed to their hotels and temporary billets across the surrounding area. He was still at his desk. He'd told himself he was finishing administrative notes. He wasn't finishing administrative notes. He was waiting for the data, and when it came through, he opened it immediately and started reading before his coffee had a chance to cool. The 3 facilities were geographically spread, one in Nevada, one in Georgia, one in Washington State. Different terrains, different climate profiles, different range configurations, different commanding officers with different evaluation philosophies. Nothing about them should have produced a coherent statistical pattern when viewed together. Each facility ran its own program. Each reported up its own chain. There was no standing requirement for cross-facility comparative analysis at the level of individual shooter performance, which meant no one had looked at this data side by side before. There had been no reason to. Brooks built the comparison manually, pulling each facility's quarterly scores for the shooters Olivia Coyne had named cross-referencing against the dates she would have been present at each facility based on her transfer records. It took him 40 minutes. When he finished, he sat back in his chair and looked at the numbers. 17 shooters across 3 facilities, all performing in the bottom half of their cohort rankings prior to a specific date range, all showing a marked, consistent, statistically implausible improvement in the 2 to 4 quarters following that date range. Not a gradual improvement of the kind you'd attribute to accumulated experience or routine training progression. A step change, a before and after line that was clean enough to draw with a ruler. He pulled up the specific split time data on environmental targets, the shots that required the most sophisticated compensation for heat in wind variables. That's where the separation was sharpest. The 17 shooters Olivia had worked with were outperforming their cohort peers by the widest margin, specifically on the targets where standard reactive compensation methods broke down. They were doing something different on those shots, something that worked. Brooks put his pen down and looked at the ceiling for a moment. She hadn't just taught 17 people a skill. She had produced a measurable, documented, reproducible change in performance outcomes that was sitting right there in 4 years of facility data, invisible only because no one had looked across the right set of variables at the same time. He picked up his pen and wrote one line at the bottom of his notepad. This is a training program. It's been running for 4 years. We just didn't know. He underlined it twice the same way he'd underlined the first observation about her on the range, and then he sat with it for a long time in the quiet of the empty facility. At 0750 in the following morning, Olivia was already outside Brooks's office when he arrived, not waiting in the way that suggested impatience or anxiety, seated on the bench beside the door, with her newer notebook open in her lap, writing in it with the same focused economy she brought to everything. She looked up when she heard him coming, closed the notebook, and stood. "You were up late," she said. Brooks looked at her. "How do you know that?" "The data request came through documentation at 2214, she said. "That's a 4-hour analysis minimum if you were building the cross-facility comparison by hand, which you had to do because the comparative infrastructure doesn't exist. You built it yourself. That means you were at your desk until at least 2 in the morning. He stared at her. "You knew I'd do that last night." "I knew you'd do it," she said. "I wasn't certain of the timing." He unlocked his office and held the door. She walked in and sat down across from his desk with the ease of someone who'd been in many offices and found them neither impressive nor intimidating. He sat across from her, put his notepad on the desk between them, and turned it so she could read the line he'd written the night before. She read it. Her expression didn't change, but she nodded once, the specific nod of someone whose math has just been confirmed by someone else's independent calculation. 4 years, Brooks said. 3 years and 8 months, she said, with no authorization. With no obstruction, she said. He considered how to push back on that distinction and decided the distinction was accurate enough that pushing back would be intellectually dishonest. The step change, he said, on environmental targets specifically. That's where the methodology has the highest leverage, she said. Standard training already handles most fixed condition shooting adequately. The gap is in dynamic environmental compensation. That's where rounds are lost. And your method closes the gap. My method moves the shooter from reactive to predictive, she said, which changes the fundamental relationship between the shooter and the conditions. You stop chasing and start leading. Brooks leaned forward. Why hasn't anyone else developed this? You're not the only person who's noticed that reactive compensation has a ceiling. People have noticed, Olivia said. The theoretical work exists in pieces in academic literature that most field shooters don't read. What didn't exist was a practical translation, something you could actually teach to a working shooter in the field without a computational support system, something you could put in a notebook and execute alone. You built the practical translation. I built it because I needed it, she said simply. I was losing shots I shouldn't have been losing, and I didn't have a better answer available, so I built one. That sentence hit Brooks with a quiet force, the matter-of-factness of it, The absence of drama in the description of what was by any objective measure a significant intellectual and technical achievement. She'd needed something, it didn't exist, she created it. The way you describe making coffee when the machine breaks. Mercer is coming at 0900, she said. I know, Brooks said. He'll want to learn it quickly. And that's not how it works, she said. The methodology isn't a technique you bolt onto existing practice. It requires a specific kind of patience that most high-performing shooters have trained themselves out of. She paused. Mercer is very good at reacting fast and correcting fast. What I'll be asking him to do is slow down at the exact moment his instincts are telling him to act. That's going to be uncomfortable for him. How uncomfortable? Enough that he'll probably push back in the first hour, she said. The question is whether he pushes back constructively or defensively. Brooks thought about the Mercer he'd watched yesterday, the man who'd mocked Olivia in the morning and apologized to her in the parking lot in the afternoon and shown up to the debrief looking like someone who'd had something rearranged in his understanding of the world. I think he'll push back constructively, he said. I think so too, Olivia said. I just wanted you to know the friction is coming. At 0852, Ryan Mercer knocked on Brooks's office doorframe. He was carrying a standard composition notebook still in its store wrapping, which he'd clearly purchased at the facility commissary that morning. The shrink wrap was still on it. He peeled it off in the doorway with the slightly self-conscious energy of someone who is committed to a gesture and is following through on it regardless. I wasn't sure what kind, he said. That kind is fine, Olivia said. Mercer sat down. The three of them were quiet for a moment, in the way that happens when three people are all aware that whatever comes next matters, and none of them want to waste it on small talk. Before we start, Mercer said, I want to say something. He looked at Olivia. Not an apology. I already did that. Something else. He paused. I told Hatch and Webb last night that my read on you was wrong from the start. Not just the performance assessment, the whole thing. I want you to know that went further than just me saying it to myself. Olivia looked at him. What did they say? Webb said he'd figured it out by target 3, Mercer said. Hatch said he still thought the equipment was inadequate. He paused. He's coming around. Something moved briefly across Olivia's face. Not quite a smile, the shadow of one. Tell Hatch the equipment is whatever you can control, she said. Everything else is math. Mercer wrote that down, not as a quote, just wrote it down. The instinct of someone who's decided to start treating the words in front of them as worth keeping. That single gesture, uncapped pen notebook, open writing on the first page, shifted the energy in the room in a way that Brooks noticed and Olivia clearly noted. She began. She didn't preamble, it didn't contextualize, it didn't explain what she was about to explain before explaining it. She simply opened her notebook to a specific page and placed it on the desk where Mercer could see it, and she said, This is what I wrote before target 9 yesterday. Mercer leaned forward. The page showed a series of notations that were part numerical, part shorthand, part a kind of spatial mapping that didn't immediately resolve into anything recognizable. He studied it for a long moment. I can't read this, he said. No, she said, because it's calibrated to me. The notation system is built around my specific observation methods and my baseline reference points. What you'll develop will look different. So this isn't something I copy. This is something you understand and then build your own version of, she said. The structure is transferable. The specifics are personal. Mercer sat back. How long did it take you to develop your version? 4 years of active iteration, she said. You'll be faster because you're starting with the framework. The first version of this worked in about 6 months for most of my students. What took longer was refinement. 6 months, Mercer said. He wasn't objecting to the timeline, just sitting with it. The performance improvement starts earlier than that, Olivia said. You'll see a measurable difference within 8 to 10 weeks on environmental targets, but the full methodology takes longer to internalize. Brooks watched Mercer's face during this exchange. The man was doing something specific and visible. He was managing the impulse to compete with the timeline, to say something that established he would do it faster, that he was the exception. He managed it. He kept his pen on the paper and his eyes on the notebook page. Brooks found himself quietly respecting that. Show me the first element, Mercer said. The morning moved quickly after that. Olivia worked through the foundational structure of the methodology. with the efficiency of someone who had explained it 17 times before and understood exactly where each conceptual handoff needed to happen. She wasn't a slow teacher. She didn't repeat herself unnecessarily, didn't simplify beyond what was accurate, didn't cushion the difficulty of what she was describing. But she also didn't lose Mercer. She watched him with the same attention she gave everything, calibrating the pace to his processing speed, pulling back when he needed time and accelerating when he was ready. By 10:30, Mercer had filled 11 pages of his new notebook. His handwriting was getting faster and then slower, the rhythm of someone alternating between getting things down quickly and stopping to think about what he'd just written. His questions were getting sharper, less foundational, and more structural, the questions of someone who has understood the base layer and is now pushing into the implications of it. At 10:41, he said, "The pause before engagement, the observation window you said 20 to 30 seconds minimum. For the core calculation, yes," Olivia said. "Under operational conditions, that's not always available," he said. "In a dynamic environment, 30 seconds can be 12 seconds," she said. He stopped. "What?" "With full internalization of the framework, the minimum functional observation window compresses to 12 seconds, she said. "The longer windows in evaluation conditions are for calibration purposes, for building the observational baseline the methodology runs on. Once that baseline is established and maintained, the minimum compresses significantly." Mercer looked at her. 12 seconds. "For the core environmental factors, yes. Wind behavior and heat distortion projection. Additional factors require additional time, but those are the primary variables in most engagement conditions. And your students are doing this at 12 seconds. The ones who've been running the methodology for over a year, yes. 2 of them are doing it faster than that in controlled trials, but I haven't confirmed 12 seconds as their operational minimum yet. I want more data before I claim it." The understatement in that last sentence, 2 of her students were potentially performing the full environmental projection calculation in under 12 seconds, and she wanted more data before claiming it landed in the room with a quiet weight that took a moment to settle. Mercer wrote something in his notebook, then looked up. "These 2 students," he said, "where are they?" "One is at a facility in Washington State," Olivia said. "The other is currently deployed." "Deployed doing what kind of work?" "The kind that requires this methodology to work in under 12 seconds, she said, and the way she said it closed the question with a specificity that told Mercer everything he needed to know without telling him anything that shouldn't leave the room. He nodded, wrote something else. Then he said, "Is there a student who didn't take to it? Someone who tried and couldn't make it work?" The question was perceptive enough that Brooks looked at Mercer with a slight recalibration. That was a good question. The right question, actually, the one that illuminated the edges of the methodology's reach more precisely than the success cases. Olivia thought about it. "One," she said, "a shooter in Georgia, strong technical foundation, excellent reactive compensation skills, one of the best split times at his facility on standard course configurations." "What went wrong?" "He couldn't slow down," she said. "Not at the beginning. At the beginning, he was patient enough. The problem was that as his proficiency in the methodology increased, his instinct to move faster increased with it. He kept trying to compress the observation window before the baseline was established. He was cutting steps he hadn't internalized yet." "What happened to his scores?" "They regressed," she said, "below his pre-methodology baseline. He was in a gap. He'd disrupted his reactive approach without fully establishing the predictive one." "Did he recover?" "He's still working on it," she said. "He's at 8 months. The compression issues are improving, but he's behind where most students are at 8 months, she paused. "He's also the best natural shooter I've worked with. If he gets through the gap, he'll be exceptional." Mercer sat with that for a moment, and Brooks could see him running a private self-assessment. Is that me? Could that be me? He was doing the honest version of it, not the protective version. "Am I a risk for that pattern?" Mercer said. Olivia looked at him with the direct attention she gave everything. "You're a risk for the early stages of it, yes. Your instincts are very fast. That's a strength that will become a specific problem in approximately the 3rd week of practice, when the observation protocol starts to feel redundant because it's becoming familiar, but it isn't yet internalized." She paused. "When that happens, I need you to slow down anyway, even when it feels unnecessary." especially when it feels unnecessary. Mercer wrote that down, all of it. Brooks's phone rang at 11:17. He glanced at the screen, stood, and stepped out of the office without explanation. The call was from Colonel Andrea Voss, who was 2 levels above him in the facility oversight chain and had apparently seen the evaluation scores that morning. "The Carter score," Voss said. Her voice was the controlled level tone of a senior officer processing information that has disrupted a preformed understanding. "Yes, ma'am," Brooks said. 86 seconds below the previous record. "Correct. Under the standard evaluation parameters. All standard parameters, yes, ma'am. No deviations." A pause. "Who is she, Major?" Brooks thought about the 7-page file. He thought about the 4 years of cross-facility scoring data. He thought about what was happening in his office at this moment, a methodology being transferred between elite shooters in a notebook that had been hand-carried across 3 states. "That's what I'm working on, understanding," he said, which was accurate and also not the whole answer. "Work faster," Voss said. "I have 3 people above me asking questions I don't have answers to. I'll have a preliminary briefing ready by 1400, ma'am." "Make it 1300, Voss said and ended the call. Brooks went back into his office. Mercer and Olivia both looked at him. He held up 2 fingers in Mercer's direction, the signal that the session had 2 hours before it needed to conclude. Mercer nodded and turned back to Olivia. "The practical application," he said. "You mentioned wind behavior modeling based on observable indicators. I want to start there." "Start with what you already observe," and Olivia said. "Not new data, the data you're already reading but not using correctly." "What do I do with it currently?" "You use it to adjust after the fact," she said. "A gust moves your first shot right, you compensate left. A heat shimmer distorts your range estimate, you add or subtract. You're in a constant correction cycle." "Yes." "The same data tells you what's coming," she said. "Wind indicators oscillate at predictable intervals under specific pressure conditions. Heat distortion patterns have a directional component based on surface temperature gradient and incoming light angle. You can read both of those forward instead of backward." She paused. "The first exercise I give every student is this: spend 1 range session without shooting. Just observe. Write down every environmental indicator you see, and then write down what you predict it will do in the next 30 seconds. Then watch what it actually does." "Prediction against observation," Mercer said. "Prediction against observation," she confirmed. "You do it for a full session. You'll be wrong most of the time. That's the point. You're not trying to be right. You're trying to find your specific error patterns where your predictions are consistently off and in which direction. That's your personal calibration baseline." Mercer was writing. His pen was moving faster now. The urgency of someone who can see the shape of what they're learning and is impatient to get to the full picture. "And once I have the baseline, then we start building the correction factors that are specific to you," she said. "Every shooter has a particular set of observational biases. The way your eye processes distance versus the way your mind interprets what your eye reports. The way you weight wind data relative to heat data. These things vary between individuals, and the methodology has to account for them, or it won't perform at its ceiling." "You built this from scratch," Mercer said. He wasn't questioning it. He was saying it out loud again the way you do when a fact keeps surprising you each time you come back to it. "I built it from a problem," she said. "The problem was that I kept losing shots I shouldn't lose. I couldn't accept that as a permanent condition, so I worked on it until it wasn't a condition anymore." Mercer looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "How many shots did you lose before you solved it?" Olivia thought about this. "Enough that I stopped counting," she said. "Enough that I understood the counting wasn't the point. Understanding why was the point." A long silence. Outside the facility was coming into its midday rhythm, the distant sounds of the range running a secondary evaluation equipment, moving vehicles on the access road. Inside Brooks's office, the 3 of them sat with the weight of what was in Mercer's notebook and the larger question of what happened to it next. Brooks looked at Olivia. "Voss is going to want to talk to you," he said. "I know," she said. "That doesn't concern you." "It concerns me appropriately," she said. "I'm not indifferent to how this goes from here. I'm just not in control of how it goes from here." "You've been in control of most of it so far," he said. "I've been in control of my part," she said. "My part was the methodology, the proof of concept, and finding people capable of carrying it. That part is done. She looked at Brooks steadily. The next part is yours. The word yours landed with a specificity that made Brooks sit very still. He understood what she was saying. She had designed this entire sequence, the record, the debrief, the conversation in the corridor, the scoring data she knew he'd pull the morning session with Mercer as a handoff. She had built the case, documented the performance created. The evidence started the chain of transmission through Mercer and was now transferring the institutional question to the person who had the institutional standing to answer it. You planned this facility, he said. I planned the demonstration, she said. I planned the data trail. I planned the conversation. A pause. I didn't plan yesterday's wind pattern. That was the only part I had to wait for. Mercer looked up from his notebook. You waited for the right conditions, he said. I always wait for the right conditions, she said. That's the whole methodology. At 12:45, Brooks walked down the corridor towards Colonel Voss's office with his notepad, his tablet, and the preliminary briefing he'd assembled in the 40-minute gap between the session's end and the meeting. The briefing covered the record, the file discrepancy, the cross-facility scoring analysis, and with careful, precise language that he had spent most of those 40 minutes getting right, the unofficial training program that had been running for 3 years and 8 months across 3 installations without producing a single flag or complaint, because every outcome it generated looked from the outside exactly like normal performance improvement. He stopped outside Voss's door, hand raised to knock, and thought for a moment about the woman sitting in his office with her notebook waiting. He thought about what Gaines had said on the phone. That's how she wanted it. He thought about what she'd said in the corridor. The point was never the methodology. The point was the result. He thought about 17 shooters performing at the top of their cohorts. He thought about one of them deployed right now doing work that required a 12-second environmental projection in conditions where standard reactive compensation would not have been enough. He thought about what it meant that this had been built quietly, carefully, without institutional support, without recognition, without a single line in a 7-page file that acknowledged it existed and had worked anyway. Then he knocked on Voss's door, and when he heard her voice on the other side, he went in and he told her what he knew starting from the beginning and leaving nothing out. 2 floors below in the facility's equipment check room, Dennis Hatch was talking to Aaron Webb and trying to figure out whether what he'd watched the day before required him to change any opinions he'd held for a long time, or whether there was a version of events where he could fold it into what he already believed without too much adjustment. Webb listened to him work through this for approximately 3 minutes before saying, Hatch. What? She broke the record by a minute and a half. I know. With factory glass. I know. And she taught 17 other people to do the same kind of thing, Webb said, and none of us knew it. Hatch was quiet. What exactly? Webb said. Are you trying not to change your mind about? Hatch didn't answer right away. The silence lasted long enough to be its own kind of answer. Then he said, I don't like being wrong. Nobody does, Webb said. She gets up anyway. Hatch looked at him. What does that mean? It means the wind doesn't care, Webb said, using words he had heard in a briefing room the afternoon before. And apparently neither does she. Colonel Andrea Voss did not interrupt Brooks once during the 47 minutes he spent laying out everything he had. That alone told him something. Voss was not a patient listener by nature. She was the kind of senior officer who moved information along, briskly asked clarifying questions before you'd finish the sentence, that would have clarified them and operated with the efficient impatience of someone who had more demands on her time than hours to meet them. The fact that she sat across from Brooks for 47 minutes without once cutting him off meant that what he was telling her had reached a register she wasn't accustomed to operating in. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Show me the cross-facility data again. He turned the tablet toward her. She studied it the way she studied everything rapidly, with the kind of focused absorption that missed nothing. Her finger moved down the column of before and after scores, pausing at the sharpest step changes, the places where a shooter's environmental target performance jumped 2 tiers in a single quarterly evaluation. These are real scores, she said, not a question, a thing she needed to say out loud to confirm it had landed correctly. Verified against facility records, Brooks said. I cross-referenced the scoring logs independently. And the connection to Carter. Transfer dates align in every case, Brooks said. She was present at each facility during the window immediately preceding the performance shift. Never longer than 6 months at any one installation. 6 months, Voss said. Enough time to work with 3 to 6 shooters at each facility, apparently, Brooks said. She was selective. She didn't approach everyone, only the ones she assessed as capable of carrying the methodology forward. Voss looked up from the tablet. She was recruiting, she said. Brooks paused. He hadn't used that word. He'd been careful not to because the word carried implications that complicated the picture. But now that Voss had said it, he couldn't disagree with the accuracy of it. She was building a network, he said. 17 people who all share the same foundational framework, none of whom know each other, none of whom were told there were others. Each of them thinks they received individual instruction. Do they know where it came from, Voss said. Do they know Carter developed it? I don't know, Brooks said. I haven't spoken to the students directly. Voss set the tablet down and looked at him with the precise attention of someone triangulating between 3 different responses and deciding which one served the situation. What's your read on her intent? She said. Straight, Brooks said without hesitation. Everything she did was oriented toward getting the methodology into institutional use. The record was a proof of concept. The session with Mercer this morning was a proof of transfer showing that it could be taught. The data trail she knew I'd pull was the evidentiary foundation. He paused. She built the whole case from the ground up. She just needed someone with the institutional standing to carry it the rest of the way. She needed you, Voss said. She needed this office, Brooks said. Voss was quiet for a moment. Get her in here, she said. Ma'am. Not as a subject, Voss said with a precision that told Brooks she understood exactly how that request could be misread. As a briefer, I want to hear the methodology from her directly, and I want Mercer in the room. Mercer, if this thing is going to move through the training command, it needs an advocate with credibility inside the current competitive community, Voss said. Mercer has that. Carter has the record and the data. Together, they're a case I can take upstairs without it sounding like a theoretical exercise. She paused. Can you have them here at 1500? I'll confirm, Brooks said and stood. He found Olivia in the equipment check room, where she'd apparently spent the gap between the morning session and the current moment, doing exactly what she'd done at the start of the previous day observing. She was watching the afternoon range evaluation through the window notebook, open writing in it, with the quiet focus of someone for whom watching a range environment was never idle time. Voss wants to see you at 1500, he said. She didn't look up immediately, finished the notation she was making, then closed the notebook and looked at him. What's her posture? She wants to take this upstairs, Brooks said. She's thinking about institutional adoption. She wants you and Mercer in the room together. Something moved briefly across Olivia's face. Satisfaction wasn't quite the word, more like the recognition of a distance measured and found to match the calculation. Mercer's on board with that. I haven't asked him yet, Brooks said. But yes. Took him directly, she said. Don't only frame it as required. He needs to choose it. Brooks looked at her. Why does that matter at this stage? Because in 6 months, Mercer is going to be teaching this to 3 or 4 people at this facility, she said, and the authority he carries into that room depends entirely on whether he arrived there by choice or by direction. People can tell the difference. She paused. Ask him directly. Brooks found Mercer at the range perimeter, which also did not surprise him. Mercer was standing with his arms crossed, watching the afternoon evaluation the same way Olivia had been watching it from the window, except his notebook wasn't out yet. He had it in his hand unopened, like he was thinking about opening it and hadn't decided yet. Mercer, Brooks said. Mercer turned. His eyes had the particular quality of someone who has been doing serious thinking and is slightly reluctant to interrupt it. Sir, Voss wants you in a meeting at 1500. Hermie Carter, taking the methodology case to the level where it might actually become something formal. Brooks kept his voice level. I'm asking you, not ordering you, Carter's specific request. Mercer looked at him. She wants me to choose it. She said you'd need to. She's right, Mercer said. He looked back at the range for a moment, then back at Brooks. Yes, he said, I'm in. Bring the notebook, Brooks said. Already planned on it, Mercer said and uncapped his pen. At 14:20, while Brooks was organizing his briefing materials and Olivia was in the facility's small commissary drinking coffee she didn't appear to need, Dennis Hatch walked up to her table and stood there with the particular posture of a man executing something he's rehearsed but still finds difficult. Carter, he said. Olivia looked up. Hatch. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down without asking, which told her the rehearsal had been shorter than the execution was going to be. She waited. I want to say something, he said. Okay, she said. He looked at his hands for a second. Yesterday morning when Mercer said what he said, the museum piece comment, the rest of it I laughed. He said it flat without softening. I want you to know I'm aware of that. I know you are, Olivia said. I'm not asking for absolution, he said quickly. I'm not doing that thing where you apologize so you can feel better about it. I'm saying I was wrong and I know I was wrong and I want to understand how I didn't see it coming. He paused. Because I should have. I've been doing this long enough to know better than to read a shooter by their equipment before they shoot. Olivia looked at him for a moment. Then she said, You read the room instead of the individual. Yeah, he said. Mercer had already established the frame, she said. Museum piece, wrong place, wrong profile. You slotted into a pre-existing read rather than building your own. That's fast cognition. It's efficient in most contexts. She paused. It's a liability on the range and sometimes off it. Hatch looked at her. Is that what you teach? Among other things, she said. Can I ask something, he said. You're going to, she said. The slight directness of that made him pause. And then unexpectedly, it made him almost smile. What did your first note say, he asked, and the first thing you wrote in the notebook, before you ever came here? Olivia considered this. Then she opened her newer notebook, not the evaluation one, the one she'd had in the briefing room, and turned it to the first page. She set it in front of him. The first line read, Wind from northwest oscillation pattern indicates 4-minute cycle. Heat differential at target 9 will peak at approximately 10:47. Adjust early. Hatch stared at it. You wrote this before you shot. I wrote it before I got into position, she said, during the pre-evaluation staging window. Target 9, he said. That was the one where you paused the longest. The prediction required the most refinement, she said. The conditions were at the edge of the calculable range. I needed to write it out fully before I trusted it. Hatch sat back. He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that the commissary's ambient, sounds-low conversation from 2 other tables, the hum of the refrigeration unit, became audible between them. Then he said, How many people know how to do this? 17, she said, plus Mercer, who was starting. Plus Mercer, he said. He looked at the notebook page. That's not many. No, she said, another silence. Hatch put his hands flat on the table and looked at her with the directness of someone who has gotten past the difficult part and is now in the cleaner territory on the other side. Teach me, he said. Olivia looked at him for a moment. The assessment she ran was visible in the brief pause, a slight recalibration of her attention. Then she said, Can you be still? What? For 30 seconds before you engage, she said. Every time, without exception, even when your instincts say it's a waste of time. Can you do that consistently? Hatch thought about it, really thought about it, not the reflexive answer. I don't know, he said honestly. That's the right answer, she said. She picked up her notebook and closed it. Be on the range at 0700 tomorrow. Bring a notebook, not a dope card, and don't shoot anything. Don't shoot anything, he said. Not one round, she said. Just watch and write. I'll tell you what to look for. He stared at her. And if I can't be still, then we'll work on that first, she said, standing. Because the methodology doesn't function without it. The stillness is the foundation. Everything else is built on top of it. She picked up her coffee, took the last sip, and walked out of the commissary toward the corridor that led to Voss's office wing. Hatch sat at the table and looked at the empty chair across from him, and then he pulled out his phone and set an alarm for 0630. At 14:58, Brooks, Olivia, and Mercer sat outside Colonel Voss's office in the 3 chairs lined against the corridor wall. Mercer had his notebook open. He was reviewing his morning notes with the focused attention of someone preparing testimony. Olivia had nothing open. She sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes forward, running something through her mind that had the quality of a final check rather than preparation. Brooks had his tablet and his notepad, and the particular contained energy of someone who has done the work and is now waiting to find out if the work was enough. At precisely 1500, Voss's door opened. The meeting lasted 1 hour and 19 minutes. Brooks had expected an hour, maybe 70 minutes, given the complexity of what they were presenting. Voss ran it tighter than that with the kind of disciplined focus that moved from data to implication to application without lingering in any one place longer than the information required. She let Olivia speak first. That was the tell the senior officer in the room relinquishing the floor before establishing her own frame was a deliberate signal, and everyone in the room read it correctly. Olivia laid out the methodology in the condensed form of someone who had briefed it many times, which she had, and answered Voss's questions with the same calibrated precision she brought to everything. No overstatement, no advocacy that outran the evidence, just the framework, the data, and the results. When Olivia finished, Voss looked at Mercer. "You started learning this morning," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "What's your read on it?" Mercer thought for a moment, not performing consideration, actually considering. "It changes the fundamental posture," he said. "Every shooter I know operates in a correction cycle. You fire, you assess, you correct. Carter's methodology eliminates most of the correction cycle by moving the assessment before the shot instead of after." He paused. "The hard part isn't understanding it. The hard part is being willing to slow down long enough to let it work. That's where most high performers are going to resist it." "Including you," Voss said. "Especially me," Mercer said. Voss looked at him for a moment with an expression that didn't shift but somehow indicated something positive. Then she looked at the cross-facility data on her own tablet. She'd pulled it up independently before the meeting, Brooks noted, and said, 17 shooters over 4 years with no documentation, no authorization, and no complaints. "Correct, ma'am," Olivia said. "I'm going to ask you something directly," Voss said, "and I want the direct answer." "Yes, ma'am." "Did you stay in undocumented because you didn't trust the institution to handle this correctly?" The room went still. Brooks held his breath without quite realizing it. Mercer's pen stopped moving. Olivia was quiet for 3 seconds. Then she said, "Yes." Voss didn't react. "Tell me why." "Because new methodologies introduced through official channels get evaluated on administrative criteria before they get evaluated on performance criteria," Olivia said. "Who developed them, what their standing is, whether they have the right credentials and the right backing. The evaluation of the methodology itself comes last if it comes at all." She paused. "I didn't have the standing. I wasn't going to acquire it through the standard path quickly enough for the methodology to survive the process." Another pause. "So I built the case first. Performance data from 17 shooters across 4 years and 3 facilities. A record that nobody could dispute. And then I found someone with the institutional standing to carry it." The last sentence landed in the room with a weight that took a moment to settle because the someone she was describing was in the room and everyone understood that. Voss looked at Brooks. Brooks looked back at her. There was a full conversation in that exchange that neither of them needed to speak aloud. Voss turned back to Olivia. "You built a case designed specifically to overcome institutional resistance before the institution knew resistance was what it was going to offer." "Yes, ma'am." "That required a specific read on how this command structure operates." "Yes." "Where did you develop that read?" Olivia paused. "I've been inside this institution for 14 years, she said. "I know how it works. I know what it responds to and what it doesn't. Performance data it responds to. Record-breaking it responds to. A staff sergeant with a 7-page file asking for curriculum development authority." She stopped. "It doesn't respond to," Voss finished. "No, ma'am." Another silence. Then Voss said, "Your file." "Ma'am." 7 pages. "Yes, ma'am." "Intentional." "Yes, ma'am." "The scores at previous facilities. The unremarkable evaluations." Olivia said nothing. "You were sandbagging," Voss said. "I was performing within what each evaluation was designed to measure," Olivia said carefully. "Don't do that," Voss said, but without heat. "Not in this room, not now." A beat. Then Olivia said quietly, "Yes, ma'am, I was sandbagging." Voss sat with that for a moment. Then she said, "Why stop?" "The conditions were right," Olivia said, "and the case was complete." She paused. "And I've been carrying this alone for 4 years. I'm tired of carrying it alone." That last sentence was the first thing Olivia had said in 2 days that didn't have the quality of something carefully constructed. It came out with a weight that was different from the rest. Not vulnerability exactly, but the edge of it, the place where long-sustained self-sufficiency finally acknowledges its own cost. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Voss said, Here's what's going to happen. She leaned forward. I'm taking the cross-facility data to the training command with a recommendation for a formal pilot program. 6-month initial cycle, 8 to 12 shooters, Ridgecrest as the primary facility, Carter as the lead instructor, Mercer as the program liaison to the competitive community. She looked at Olivia. I need the methodology documented, fully, not a notebook, a curriculum. I can have a draft framework in 2 weeks, Olivia said. I need it in 10 days, Voss said. Olivia paused. 10 days? The window at training command, it is in 12, Voss said. I need 2 days to prepare the pitch. 10 days, Olivia confirmed. One more thing, Voss said. Your file, I'm having it corrected. The evaluations you sandbagged will be flagged and reassessed based on the actual performance data I'm now aware of. Your record will reflect what you actually did not, what you allowed to be recorded. Olivia was quiet for a moment. That will create questions. Yes, Voss said. It will. And those questions will be answered by the same record that answers every other question anyone has about you. She paused. You built the case. Let the case speak. Mercer was looking at Olivia. She was looking at Voss. Her expression had the quality it always had, settled, unperturbed, but there was something underneath it now that hadn't been as visible before. Not emotion exactly, more like the posture of someone who has been holding a weight at arm's length for a very long time and has just been told they can set it down. The meeting ended at 16:19. As they filed out of Voss's office into the corridor, Mercer fell into step beside Olivia and said nothing for a moment. They walked the length of the corridor in that silence, and then he said, 10 days. 10 days, she confirmed. Do you actually need 10 days or do you need 3? And you gave yourself the extra margin. She looked at him sideways. Something in her expression was different from the measured composure of the previous 2 days, not quite a smile, but close enough to recognize. 7, she said, but I'll use all 10. Because the documentation needs to be right, she said. The methodology can survive a flawed field execution. It cannot survive a flawed written framework. If the curriculum is wrong, every instructor who reads it introduces the error into every shooter they teach. She paused. 10 days. Do you want help? Mercer said. She looked at him. You've had the framework for 6 hours. Which means I can tell you where it isn't clear, he said. Where a reader without your internal map is going to get lost. Where the language assumes context that isn't on the page. He paused. You've been inside this methodology for 4 years. You can't see where it's opaque to an outsider. I can. Olivia walked 2 more steps before she said anything. Then 0800 tomorrow. Bring the notebook. I'll be there, Mercer said. He peeled off toward the parking area, and she continued down the corridor alone. Brooks, who had been walking 6 paces behind them and had heard the entire exchange, stopped at the corner and watched her go, the same quiet, unhurried walk she'd had when she arrived the previous morning, the same rifle case hanging from her right hand, the same total absence of visible satisfaction in what had just been accomplished. He thought about what she'd said in Voss's office, the one sentence that hadn't been designed. I've been carrying this alone for 4 years. I'm tired of carrying it alone. He thought about what it took to carry something like that, not just the methodology itself, but the knowledge that it worked and the patience to wait for the moment when the right conditions existed to release it. The discipline of watching your own work succeed in other people's hands without claiming credit for it. The willingness to sit in a 7-page file and wait. He thought about 17 shooters who were performing at the top of their cohorts, none of them knowing they were connected to each other. All of them carrying a piece of something that had started in one woman's notebook on a range somewhere and worked its way outward in silence year by year until it was too large and too documented to remain invisible. He thought about the record, 1742, New Ridgecrest facility record. The sentence that had started all of this, the public fact that made every other fact findable, the performance that turned the invisible visible. She had planned it to be exactly that. Not a personal achievement. A door she'd opened from the outside using the only key the institution would respond to. He walked back to his office. On his desk, his notepad was still open to the page, with Carter's name at the top and Y underlined below it. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he turned the page, wrote a new heading at the top, and started drafting the framework for the preliminary briefing he'd need to have ready for Voss in 2 days. The heading read Carter Methodology Pilot Program Case. He didn't underline it. He didn't need to. At 18:30, Ryan Mercer was sitting in his temporary billet with his notebook open to page 1 and his pen moving, translating his morning session notes into something more structured, annotated, organized, beginning to take the shape of something that could be taught rather than just received. He worked for 2 hours without stopping. When he finally put the pen down, he looked at what he'd produced and thought it was probably the most useful thing he'd written in 9 years of competitive shooting. He thought about Olivia in the parking lot the previous afternoon. The wind doesn't care about your rank. The target doesn't care about your story. He'd written that down the moment he got to his vehicle. He hadn't been sure why at the time. He knew why now, because it was the whole methodology in 2 sentences. Stop competing with the environment. Start learning it. He closed the notebook. Outside, the Arizona dark had come down fully, and the range was quiet, and somewhere across the facility, a woman was working on a 10-day deadline to write down something she'd spent 4 years building so that the institution she'd worked around could finally officially work with her instead. He set his alarm for 07:45. Olivia finished the first draft of the curriculum framework in 6 days. Not 10, not 7, 6. She didn't tell Brooks or Mercer when it was done. She read it through twice, put it away for 18 hours, read it a third time with the critical distance that the gap produced, and then revised it. The revision took another day and a half. When she finally sent the document to Brooks's secure inbox at 06:12 on the 8th morning, it was 43 pages. And every page was the kind of clean that only comes from someone who has known the material long enough that the words and the understanding behind them have become the same thing. Brooks opened it at 06:48. He read it without stopping. When he finished, he sat at his desk for a full minute without moving. Then he forwarded it to Voss with a single line, "This is better than anything I've seen come out of the formal curriculum development process in 7 years." Voss read it before 7. She called Brooks at 7:12. "How much of this did Mercer contribute?" "The structural clarity," Brooks said. "The places where the language needed to be readable by someone without Carter's internal map. He caught every gap." She took his input. She took every note he gave her, Brooks said, without pushback. A pause on Voss's end, the pause of someone recalibrating. "That surprises you," she said. "Slightly," Brooks admitted. "She doesn't give ground easily, but she told me once that the methodology has to survive her. The moment she starts protecting it from honest criticism, it stops being a methodology and starts being a personal project." He paused. "She let Mercer break it because she needed to know where it would break." Voss was quiet for a moment, then, "Get me a hard copy for the training command meeting. I'll handle the rest." Brooks printed 43 pages and drove them to Voss's office himself. In the range building, Mercer was already on the floor with his notebook running the first phase of Olivia's beginner protocol. Observe, predict, record. No shooting. He'd been doing it every morning for 6 days, the same way she'd told Hatch to do it, the same way she'd had every student start. He hated the first 3 days. That was his own assessment, stated plainly to Olivia on day 4. "I hated every second of the first 3 days." "I know," she said. "You could have warned me." "I warn everyone," she said. "Nobody believes it until they live through it." He'd been right about himself. Third day was the crisis point. His instinct to shoot to act, to stop observing and start doing, had become so loud by day 3 that he'd stood at his position for 40 minutes, writing predictions with his jaw tight and his trigger hand opening and closing on nothing. The pure physical frustration of a person wired for action being asked to be still. He'd written 14 pages of predictions that day. His accuracy rate against actual conditions, when he checked his notes against the recorded sensor data that evening, was 51%. He told Olivia the number. She said, "What was it on day 1?" He checked. 34%. Day 2, 41. "So in 3 days," she said, "you went from 1 and 3 to 1 and 2. He looked at the numbers differently after that. The frustration was still there on day 4, but underneath it was something else now, the first faint signal of a pattern, the beginning of a baseline. He could feel himself starting to read the environment forward instead of backward, and the feeling was so different from anything in his existing toolkit that it was almost disorienting, like learning to see a color he hadn't known he was missing. On the morning of day 7, his accuracy rate was 68%. He didn't tell Olivia. He wrote it in the notebook and closed it and stood at the range perimeter for a long moment, and what he felt was not pride exactly, but something deeper and quieter than pride, the specific satisfaction of understanding something that had previously been beyond his reach now inside it. At 09:15 that same morning, Dennis Hatch was on the range beside him one day into his own observation protocol, working through the specific misery of day one with the tense silence of a man who had been warned and was living through the warning. His day one accuracy rate was 29%, which he reported to Olivia with the flat tone of someone delivering information he didn't enjoy. "What did I tell you to expect?" she said. "That I'd be wrong most of the time," he said. And that the point was finding the error pattern, not avoiding the errors. "Is that what you're doing?" He looked at his notebook. "I'm finding the error pattern," he said. "I tend to underestimate wind speed in the early morning window, consistently. Every prediction I made in the first hour was biased low." "That's your first calibration point," she said. "Write it at the front of the notebook. Every time you make a prediction, you'll adjust by that factor until the baseline resets." He wrote it. His handwriting was large and slightly irregular, the handwriting of someone who doesn't write by hand as much as he should, but the words were careful. He wrote wind underestimate bias AM window, adjust upward. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at Olivia. "Is mine going to be different from Mercer's?" "Completely," she said. "Your observational biases are specific to you. Your baseline will be specific to you. The framework is the same, but the calibration is personal. So every shooter who learns this ends up with a different version." "Every shooter ends up with their version," she said. 17 people, 17 notebooks, 17 calibrations. The methodology is the architecture. What you build inside it is yours." Hatch sat with that for a moment. Then he said, "How do you know it'll still work if everyone's doing it differently?" "Because the architecture is what does the work," she said. "I don't care what color you paint the house. I care that the foundation is level." He wrote that down too. On the afternoon of day 8, 2 days before the training command meeting, something happened that no one had planned for, and that changed the temperature of everything that followed. A message came through to Brooks's office from a facility in Washington state. The sender was a chief warrant officer named Patricia Lim, and the subject line was Carter methodology. "I think I know what you're looking for." Brooks read the message 3 times. Then he called Olivia into his office and handed her the tablet without comment. Lim was one of the 17. She'd been at the Washington facility for 14 months, and in those 14 months, her performance on environmental targets had gone from the bottom third of her cohort to the top 2. She had not known until she saw a facility-wide communication about a new pilot program in development at Ridgecrest that the framework she'd been running for over a year had a name or an origin point she could point to. She'd assumed it was something Olivia had developed and shared informally, the way techniques circulate in close professional communities, person to person, without institutional wrapper. What she hadn't known, and what her message was now saying, was that she had done something with it that Olivia hadn't done. She'd written it up. Not as a curriculum, as a field report, an unsanctioned personal document she'd put together because she wanted to understand why her scores had changed so sharply, and documentation was how she processed things. 40 pages of annotated performance analysis, complete with her own calibration records, her error pattern maps, her accuracy rate progression from day 1 through 14 months, and her notes on 2 other shooters she'd informally walked through the basics of the framework without ever naming it as a formal methodology. She hadn't known what to do with the document. It wasn't official. It hadn't been requested. She'd kept it in a personal folder for 7 months, and when she saw the pilot program communication, she'd done the math and sent it to Brooks. Olivia read the message twice. Her expression didn't change in the way expressions usually change, but something shifted behind her eyes, something that came and went too quickly to fully categorize. Brooks, who had been watching her for 8 days now, with the attention of someone who'd learned that her face was worth reading, carefully caught it. "You didn't know she documented it," he said. "No," Olivia said. 40 pages, he said. 14 months of performance data, with 2 additional transmissions, 2 more shooters she's been working with informally. "I know what it means," Olivia said quietly. "It means it's replicating," Brooks said. "Without you. The students are becoming teachers." She set the tablet down. She looked at her own hands for a moment, the way you look at something you have worked with for a long time and are seeing from a new angle. "I knew it was possible," she said. "I hoped for it, I didn't know it was happening. Lim's two informal students, Brooks said. You want me to pull their data? Yes, she said. But I already know what you'll find. He pulled the data. She was right. Both of Lim's informal students showed the same step change profile, the before and after line, the same sharp improvement, specifically on environmental targets. The same signature, the methodology left in scoring data like a fingerprint. The methodology was 3 generations deep and expanding without any central coordination. Brooks called Voss immediately. Voss's response was 4 words, bring Lim to Ridgecrest. At 1800 that evening, Olivia sat in the facility commissary with her newer notebook open and her coffee untouched in the expression of someone running a very large calculation. Mercer sat across from her. He'd been there for 10 minutes before she acknowledged him, not from rudeness, but from genuine absorption in whatever she was processing. Lim, he said. Lim, she confirmed. You're not surprised that it propagated, he said. You're surprised by the speed. She looked at him. I thought it would take longer. I thought the informal transmission would lose fidelity, that what students passed on would be diluted, imprecise, partial. Lim's documentation is more complete than I expected, and she said. She understood it well enough to transmit it accurately. She paused, which means the original framework is sound enough to survive informal transfer. Which means the curriculum you wrote will survive formal transfer, Mercer said. If it's taught correctly, she said, that's still the variable. That's always the variable, he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I spent 4 years doing this one person at a time, in person with direct calibration, adjusting the transmission to the specific receiver. That's controllable. That's slow, but it's precise. She looked at her notebook. A formal program scales faster and loses precision. Those two things are in tension, and I don't have a clean answer for how to hold them both. You hold them by training instructors, not just shooters, Mercer said. You teach a cohort of people who can calibrate it in person the way you did. You become the standard that the instructors are trained to. She looked at him. That's what the pilot program is. That's what the pilot program has to be, he said. Not just here. The 8 to 12 shooters Voss proposed aren't the end goal. They're the first instructor cohort. They go back to their facilities and teach it the way you taught it, one person at a time with direct calibration. He paused. You scale by multiplying teachers, not students. Olivia sat with that. It wasn't new information. The logic was built into the framework she'd submitted, but hearing it spoken back to her by someone who'd had the framework for 8 days had a specific quality. The quality of a thing that had lived only in her head for a long time, arriving intact in someone else's. You got that from the curriculum, she said. Page 31, he said, the instructor development section. You wrote it as a recommendation. I'm telling you, it's the core. She picked up her pen and wrote something in the notebook. He watched her write without reading over her shoulder. When she stopped, she said, the training command meeting is day after tomorrow. I know. Voss is going to ask you to speak. I know that too, he said. What are you going to say? Mercer thought for a moment. Not the performance of thinking the real version, the kind that required silence. I'm going to say that I've been in competitive precision shooting for 9 years, he said. That I held the top ranking at this facility for 2 consecutive quarters. That I was wrong about a shooter before I watched her shoot, and that being wrong in that specific way cost me exactly nothing because she was going to break the record regardless of what I thought. He paused. And then I'm going to say that in 8 days of working with her methodology, I have a 68% environmental prediction accuracy rate, and that number is going to be higher next week and the week after. And at some point, it's going to be high enough that the shot I lose on environmental factors becomes the exception instead of the rule. Another pause. And then I'm going to say that we should have had this 6 years ago, and the reason we didn't is something this institution needs to sit with. Olivia looked at him, a long look, the kind she gave things she was taking full inventory of. Then she said, don't say the last part. Why now? Because the people in that room are the institution, she said. You can make them want to move forward, or you can make them feel indicted for the past. You can't do both in the same meeting. She paused. And you need them to want to move forward. He considered that. You've been managing this kind of politics for 4 years. I've been managing it for 14, she said. 4 years specifically on this problem. He nodded slowly. All right, he said. I leave the last part out. Say it afterward, she said, one-on-one to Voss after the meeting. She'll hear it differently in that context. Because she'll have already said yes, he said. Because she'll have already said yes, Olivia confirmed. The training command meeting was on the morning of day 10. Brooks, Voss, Olivia, and Mercer drove together in a facility vehicle, a thing that was logistically practical, and also in its quiet way a statement. 4 people in one vehicle arriving at a command meeting as a unified presentation was a thing that did not happen by accident. In the vehicle, no one spoke much for the first 20 minutes. Then Voss said without turning around from the front seat, Carter, ma'am, when the program is approved, if, Olivia said, when Graham, Voss said with the flat certainty of a senior officer who has read the room before entering it. When it's approved and when Lim arrives and we have the full instructor cohort assembled, I want you to design the evaluation framework. Not just the curriculum, the metrics, how we measure whether the methodology is being taught correctly and whether it's producing the results it should. Olivia was quiet for a moment. That's a separate document. I know, Voss said. I'm asking for it anyway. Timeline, Olivia said. 30 days after program approval, Voss said. Another pause. Done, Olivia said. Mercer, sitting beside Olivia in the back, wrote something in his notebook without looking at it. Brooks, in the front passenger seat, watched the road and thought about the first morning about days ago when he had written Carter's name at the top of a notepad page and underlined why beneath it. He thought about all the pages he'd filled since. He thought about the 7-page file that was currently being corrected by the records division, each sparse entry being reconciled against the actual performance data that should have accompanied it for years. He thought about what the corrected file was going to look like when it was done, the real record of a 14-year career that had been for most of its length deliberately invisible. He thought about what it meant to make a choice like that, to see clearly what you were giving up and give it up anyway, because the thing you were building mattered more than the recognition for building it. He thought about 17 shooters who were better today than they would otherwise have been. He thought about Lim sitting in Washington State with a 40-page field report she had known what to do with for 7 months and 2 students of her own who were already showing the methodology's signature in their scores. He thought about Hatch on day 1 with a 29% accuracy rate and the specific honest misery of a man in the process of being changed. The training command meeting lasted 2 hours and 14 minutes. 3 colonels, 2 program directors, a senior evaluator from the Marksmanship Training Division, and a civilian advisor from the Tactical Curriculum Board. Voss presented the case. Brooks handled the data. Mercer spoke for 11 minutes clearly without the part Olivia had told him to leave out, with the 68% accuracy figure and the before and after performance data and the personal testimony of a man who had spent 8 days being remade by a framework he'd initially had no context to value. Then Olivia spoke. She spoke for 9 minutes. She started with the problem, the reactive compensation ceiling, the shots that were being lost at extreme range under dynamic environmental conditions, the gap between what standard training produced and what operational conditions required. She described the methodology with the same clean precision of the curriculum document. No overstatement, no advocacy beyond the evidence. She put Lim's data on the table without drama. Here is a student who became a teacher. Here are 2 students of that student. Here is what 3 generations of informal transmission looks like in scoring data. Here is what it looks like when something works well enough to replicate itself. She ended with 1 sentence. The methodology has been running for 3 years and 8 months. In that time, it has produced 17 documented improvements, 2 confirmed instructor-level transmissions, and 1 facility record. It is not a proposal. It is an existing capability that needs a home. Silence in the room for a moment. Then the senior evaluator from the Marksmanship Division said, "Why wasn't this brought through official channels from the beginning?" Olivia looked at him steadily. "Because I was a staff sergeant with a 7-page file," she said. "If you can show me the path through official channels that ends in this room with this data, I'll use it next time." No one answered that. No one had an answer that would have survived honest examination. The program was approved at 11:51. A 6-month pilot, 12 shooters, Ridgecrest as primary facility, with Lim confirmed as a second instructor after a direct assessment of her documentation and performance record. Carter as lead instructor, program architect, and evaluation framework designer. Mercer as program liaison to the competitive community with an additional mandate to identify candidates from the top-ranked shooters across 3 affiliated facilities. The vote was unanimous. It took 4 minutes. Walking out of the building into the Arizona midday, Brooks fell into step beside Olivia and said nothing for half a block. Then he said, "How do you feel?" She thought about it the way she thought about everything. Like the conditions were right, she said, and the shot landed. He almost laughed. It was the most emotion he'd heard in her voice in 8 days. "That's all." "That's enough," she said. Mercer caught up with them from behind, notebook in hand, already writing. "The 12 candidates," he said. "I have 6 names already." "Who?" Olivia said. He read them. She stopped walking at the 3rd name. "Vance from the Nevada facility." "You know him?" "I evaluated him 18 months ago," she said. "I didn't approach him because he was in the middle of a deployment cycle. I didn't think the timing was right." "The timing is right now," Mercer said. "Yes," she said. "It is." She started walking again. "Add him." That evening, Brooks sat at his desk one more time with his notepad. He turned back to the first page. Carter's name, why underlined below it. He looked at it for a long time. Then he turned through every page he'd filled in the past 10 days. The cross-facility data, the question about who trained her, the line he'd written and circled. She already built it. The note from the morning after Voss's meeting. "This is a training program. It's been running for 4 years. We just didn't know." He turned to the last filled page. At the bottom below his notes from the training command meeting, he wrote one more line. He wrote, "She didn't wait for permission. She built the standard and then let it speak for itself." He read it back. Then he put the pen down. In his inbox, a message from Patricia Lim had arrived 40 minutes earlier, confirming her travel to Ridgecrest and noting at the end that she'd pulled the scoring records for her 2 informal students that morning. Both had continued improving without any direct instruction from her for the past 3 months. They were running the observation protocol independently. One of them had started a notebook. That notebook, started by someone who had never met Olivia Carter, had learned a methodology from a student of a student, and had picked up a composition notebook because the framework was good enough to make a person want to write things down, was the real record. Not 1742, not a new facility record, not a 43-page curriculum or a unanimous vote in a command meeting. A notebook in the hands of someone 3 generations removed from the woman who'd built the thing that made it necessary. That was the full distance the shot had traveled. 2 days later, Mercer arrived on the range at 0700 and found Olivia already there. She was standing at the perimeter with her notebook open, watching the morning wind indicators writing. He stood beside her and opened his own notebook without speaking. They stood like that for several minutes, 2 people reading the same environment forward, running parallel calculations, arriving independently at the same understanding of what the conditions were going to do before they did it. Then Olivia said without looking up from the page, "What's your wind read?" "Northwest shift," Mercer said. "I like 'em. Oscillation cycle of approximately 5 minutes. Heat differential on the far targets will peak around 940. She wrote something, showed him the page. His prediction and hers were separated by a margin of 30 seconds on the timing and a ½ degree on the wind direction. "You're close," she said. "Not close enough," he said. "Not yet," she said, "but you will be." She closed her notebook and picked up her rifle case. Mercer watched her walk toward the range, the same walk she'd had the morning she arrived, unhurried, completely self-contained, carrying everything she needed in a worn case and a composition notebook, and 14 years of understanding that excellence was not something you announced. It was something you built piece by piece in the people around you till the building was too large and too solid to remain invisible any longer. And when the day came and the conditions were right and the shot finally had to be taken, you took it clean, precise, certain, and the target fell the way you always knew it would, because you had already done the math.